Good afternoon and welcome to Big Thinking. Bon après-midi et bienvenue à notre série de causeries Voix Grand. My name is Gabriel Miller and I'm the President and CEO of the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences, the national voice for over 90,000 researchers and students across Canada. The Federation's membership comprises over 160 universities and scholarly associations across the country. Today's event will take place in English with simultaneous interpretation into French. L'événement d'aujourd'hui se déroule en anglais avec interprétation simultanée en français. To begin, I would like to acknowledge that the Federation office and most of our staff are located on unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. Federation board members, speakers, and audience members for today's event are participating from across the country. And so we also extend our respect to all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples for their valuable past and present contributions to this land. The Big Thinking Lecture Series is committed to creating opportunities for researchers to challenge and inspire policymakers, citizens, researchers, the media, and community members on the critical questions of our time. If there are two subjects on everyone's mind right now, it's COVID-19 and the US presidential election. And we'll be talking about both of them today. Swirling around these topics are questions that our researchers are helping to answer and problems they're helping to solve. Questions about social justice, our economy, the threat of misinformation and fake news, and what governments should be doing in the face of all of these challenges. We are very excited to be presenting today's event on Care is on the Ballot, why COVID-19 should push American voters to pay greater attention to the care economy, with Dr. Rachel Brickner. We're happy to have all of you with us today. A few housekeeping notes for this virtual Big Thinking before we begin. You'll notice that the YouTube chat box is open for comments and questions. During the audience Q&A, after today's talk, you'll be able to submit your questions by typing them into this chat box. Please preface your question with the word question to help us tell questions apart from discussion. We'll also take questions in the order in which they're asked. You can join the conversation on Twitter using the Big Thinking hashtag, Big Thinking. I would like to thank Big Thinking's parliamentary sponsor, Greg Fergus, MP for Hull Elmer, and of course, our friends and partners at the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. Today's event will be moderated by Dr. Ito Pang. Dr. Pang holds the Canada Research Chair in Global Social Policy and is the Director of the Centre for Global Social Policy at the University of Toronto. She has published in areas such as family and gender policies, labor market changes, the care economy, and social and political economy of care. It's now my great pleasure to invite Dr. Pang to introduce today's speaker.
Merci, Gabe, and thank you, Gabe, for your opening remark and introduction. I'm delighted to moderate this Big Thinking lecture today. We have a very exciting lecture from Professor Rachel Brickner titled provocatively, Care is on the Ballot, why COVID-19 should push American voters to pay greater attention to the care economy. We are now only a week away from the US election. This election, like no other elections, has been anxiously watched and followed by not only the American voters, but people across the world. This is because I think not only is this election turning out to be one of the most contentious and possibly consequential elections for the US and the world, but also as it takes place in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, this election has also opened up important public policy debates on issues such as social, economic, gender, and racial equality. Of course, it has also brought to the center stage the issue of care and the care economy. The agenda for the lecture today is as follows. First, we will have a 20-minute lecture by Professor Rachel Brickner. This will be then followed by a 10-minute Q&A discussion between Rachel and me. And then we will open the floor to the public for a 20-minute Q&A session. And finally, at the end of the hour, I will ask Gabe to come back and give us the closing remark. Again, as Gabe mentioned, to submit a question, please type into the YouTube chat box prefaced with the word question. We will collect and read your questions. We will also try to address as many questions as we can during the Q&A session. So now let me introduce you to our speaker today. Professor Rachel Brickner is a professor of politics at the Acadia University, and she teaches in the area of comparative politics. Rachel received her PhD from McGill University. Her ongoing research explores the politics of public education in the United States and Canada through the lens of a feminist ethics of care. Her scholarly interests have an overarching focus on labor rights and workers' activism throughout the Americas. She is concurrently working on projects exploring the policy implications of the COVID-19 pandemic on workers in Nova Scotia. Her earlier work, including SSHRC-funded research, has focused on union activism of women and precarious workers in the food industry, as well as the rights of the migrant workers. So without much ado, I would like to invite Professor Rachel Brickner to give us her lecture. Rachel?
Hi, everyone. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from Mi'kmaq, the unceded and territory and ancestral homeland of the Mi'kmaq people. Thank you, Ito, for that introduction. Thank you to the Federation for the invitation to participate in this big thinking event. And thank you to everyone who's joined today, including my mom and dad who are out there in the universe somewhere. I really look forward to the conversation about my talk. As we know, care is on the ballot. And I just lost my script, sorry. Care is on the ballot, why COVID-19 should push American voters to pay greater attention to the care economy. As COVID-19 cases started to spread in mid-March, governors throughout the United States began ordering schools closed, but political leaders in New York held out. New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio said that, quote, "We're going to do our damnedest to keep the schools open," end quote. And New York Governor Andrew Cuomo noted that while closing schools was a local decision, it was not a no-brainer. New York City is the United States' largest public school district with 1.1 million students, and it serves a vulnerable population. Prior to the pandemic, 750,000 students were estimated to be at or below the poverty line. 1 in 10 were estimated to be homeless. 75% of students were eligible for free or reduced price lunches. And in the early debate over closing schools, City Councilman Justin Brannan noted that New York City needed a plan that helps families who, quote, "rely on our public schools for more than learning, for things like food, laundry, and heat." And then there was the issue of who would take care of children when they were not in school. Governor Cuomo was particularly concerned about parents in the healthcare field and the strain it would cause if parents needed to stay home from work. Eventually, of course, facing pressure from parents, the teachers union, local politicians and advocacy groups, and the realities of the pandemic, New York City did close their schools. But the debate there is illustrative of the importance of schools as part of the care economy. Educators care for the intellectual and academic development of students, of course, but schools also care for the material well-being of students, and they intersect with other sectors of the care economy, like healthcare, social services, and childcare. So because of all the different ways schools allow us to think about care, The shift to remote learning during the COVID pandemic has allowed Americans, and all of us really, the opportunity to make the question, how do we care for each other, explicit in political deliberation. For the American voter, the presidential election between Donald Trump and Joe Biden offers two starkly different approaches to answering this question. I'm going to continue by briefly defining what I mean by the care economy, then turn to three examples of how the shift to remote learning during COVID raises important questions about how we care for each other that ought to be deliberated by the public. I finish by talking about the choices voters face in this election. So what is the care economy? At a basic level, it refers to occupations and economic sectors like healthcare, child and elder care, education, and domestic service. Care workers in these sectors provide direct, relational, hands-on care or indirect care activities like cooking and cleaning that contribute to those sectors. Because care is relational, it can involve an emotional attachment or investment between the caregiver and the recipient of care. Currently, the International Labor Organization estimates that most care workers worldwide, about 123 million, are in the education sector. In the US, there were 3.5 million public school teachers in 2017-18, of whom the majority are women, about 76%, and the majority of those are white, 79%, and with Black and Hispanic teachers coming in at much lower levels. So this is a predominantly white and female profession in the US. Let's shift now to look at three examples of how the COVID-19 pandemic played out in schools and how this raises awareness of the importance of the care economy. I want to first return to the issue of how schools meet students' basic material needs. In the US, the National School Lunch Program provides resources to states so that schools can offer free or low-cost lunches to students in financial need. In 2019, 29.4 million children were eligible for this program. And it's not just students in urban areas like New York City who rely on this federal program. A recent story about West Virginia reported that 1 in 4 students in that state were food insecure and relied on food programs. During the summer, the Trump administration extended funding of these programs, but transportation to distribution centers was an obstacle for some families. And in some school districts in West Virginia, though not all, school districts actually relied on school buses to deliver meals to students in remote, rural, and mountainous areas. The importance of schools as part of the caring economy that provides basic material needs for children is only going to get bigger in the short term. In May, the average unemployment rate rose to 14.7% from a pre-pandemic rate of 3.8%, which was among the most historic lows in the unemployment rates in the United States in the post-World War II years. And while it has settled at 7.9%, studies suggest that between 6 and 8 million people have fallen into poverty since the end of July. So in the longer term, a question raised by students' reliance on schools for meals is how to build an economy that allows households to care for basic needs, even when unemployment is low, as it was prior to the COVID pandemic. Let me turn to a second example. Schools employ different kinds of care workers, not just teachers, but nurses, social workers, caseworkers, even homeless student coordinators who provide critical wraparound and support students for services for students who are vulnerable, have learning disabilities, or other special needs. As schools shifted online during COVID-19, there was a real concern about how all students would fare without in-person access to teachers and classmates and support workers. But there was particular concern about those students with special needs who really rely on in-person guidance. In July, ProPublica broke the story of a 15-year-old Michigan girl called Grace, who was sent to juvenile detention for not completing her online homework, which was a condition of her probation on a previous charge. Grace, who's a Black student, has an ADHD diagnosis and works with a special education teacher on an individualized education plan, or IEP, at her wealthy school district in suburban Detroit. Though she had had no attendance issues when school was in person, she had trouble focusing during the shift to online learning and reported that she was not receiving the individualized assistance that was required by her IEP. According to her teacher, Grace's performance was no different than other students when it came to turning in homework, but when it came to assessing whether she had violated the terms of her probation, the judge determined that she was, quote, guilty of failure to submit any schoolwork, end quote. Grace's story is notable because it also draws our attention to patterns of systemic racism in the treatment of students. And Grace was not the only Black student in the United States with a story of unusually punitive treatment during COVID. In Colorado, for example, a 12-year-old Black boy, also with an ADHD diagnosis, was suspended and received a visit from the police because he handled a toy gun, a Nerf gun, during a remote teaching session. The US Department of Education says that Black students are 3 times more likely than their white counterparts to be suspended and expelled. Other studies show that suspensions are much more likely to lead to arrests outside of school, and that Black youth are disproportionately represented in juvenile detention facilities. So thinking about schools as part of the care economy means not only the need to hire care workers who provide equitable access to wraparound support services for students, but also confronting systemic inequalities, including systemic racism. Ray Lanier of the organization Michigan Liberation told the New York Times in response to Grace's case, and I paraphrase a bit, quote, "We need to ask, how do we make sure that children can get the support they need so that it doesn't end with them starting to have a criminal record?" Perhaps most notably, COVID has reminded us of the role schools play as part of childcare infrastructure in supporting parents' paid employment, especially women's paid employment. With childcare centers and schools closed, women have carried the heaviest burden of juggling paid employment, childcare, and helping school-aged children navigate remote learning. A report from the US Census Bureau showed that in the 25 to 44-year-old age group, women were almost 3 times as likely as men to not be working due to childcare demands. A study by the Lean In organization showed that women were more likely than men to consider reducing hours, switching to a less demanding job, taking a leave, switching from full-time to part-time employment, and leaving the workforce entirely. In fact, jobs data from September showed that more women left the American workforce altogether than the total number of jobs added to the economy. And women's losses were concentrated in the public sector, which includes education, as well as among Black women and Latino women. Obviously, we can judge the importance of schools to the care economy in part because of the impact on women's workforce participation. But there's another important impact, which is how employers are responding. According to the Lean In study, some employers are responding to the childcare crisis by offering things like greater flexibility, paid leave time, and even stipends to support homeschooling. Importantly, however, such employer-based responses can reproduce inequities, allowing those parents with resources from employers or greater financial means in general to better manage the disruption in schooling. These privatized responses to education disruption have the potential to exacerbate an already existing gap in educational opportunity between children from high and low income families. So let me turn now to this question of how care is on the ballot. In her book, Caring Democracy, the political theorist Joan Tronto argues that if we don't make questions about how to provide care part of our public deliberations, we run the risk of reproducing inequities in terms of who we rely on to provide care, and also what kinds of access we have to receive care. For policymakers, the care economy represents a critical area of investment. In a 2018 report on care work, the International Labor Organization estimated that there's an increasing demand for paid care work. By 2030, the ILO estimates that 2.3 billion people worldwide will be care recipients, including about 100 million children aged 6 to 14. The growing demand for care means that investment in decent work in the care economy could lead to 260 million new jobs worldwide. So there's a lot of potential here. A presidential election taking place in the context of COVID-19 offers American voters an opportunity for deliberation on questions of whether and how the federal government should invest in care. As I discuss subsequently, the approaches of President Trump and former Vice President Biden present voters with a very stark choice. And just a quick note that in putting together the following information and analysis, I just went to the two candidates' campaign websites because this is where you would normally find policy agendas that voters can turn to. And I looked at these agendas with 4 specific questions in mind that come out of that previous discussion. So first, what is each candidate's view of the public role of, or the federal role in public education? Is there a focus on the care economy more broadly? Third, do proposals focus only on job creation or on raising wages? And finally, do the candidates address systemic racism or other inequalities? So let's take a look at President Trump's second-term agenda. And as an aside, he hasn't really released any comprehensive plans. There's a series of bullet points covering 11 areas. On education, Trump's goal is to provide school choice to every child in America. And choice refers to the ability of parents to choose between traditional public schools, charter schools, or using government vouchers to offset tuition at private schools. So there's really no discussion in Trump's plan of investing federally in school services. On the care economy more broadly, Trump's agenda only explicitly discusses the healthcare sector and mainly with a focus on cost cutting and also a few things that matter to voters right now, such as covering pre-existing conditions. What about raising wages as part of economic growth so that people can provide for their families? Again, Trump's agenda is really focused on job creation, and he doesn't really talk about raising wages. So for example, there's no explicit mention of raising the federal minimum wage. And finally, there's really nothing about addressing systemic inequalities. And while the administration does deserve credit for criminal justice reform passed in the first term, the second term agenda explicitly focuses on defending the police. Okay. So a voter looking at Trump's website would not find the care economy treated as either instrumental to the economy as a whole or intrinsically valuable. A voter looking at Biden's website, on the other hand, would find detailed plans that propose federal resources to support the care economy. His education plan begins by acknowledging the intrinsic value of education as part of the care sector. He says, quote, "Educators help our children learn and grow into successful adults. So for so many young people, knowing they have a teacher and school community believing in and fighting for them can make all the difference." In terms of care work more broadly, Biden's education plan calls for investing in hiring professionals to support student health and well-being. And he has a separate plan for a caregiving workforce that would invest directly in jobs in childcare, early education, and long-term care, as well as providing financial support to family members who provide unpaid caregiving activities for the elderly and disabled family members. Both of his education and care work plans explicitly discuss the importance of raising wages. He supports the right to collective bargaining, and he also supports increasing the federal minimum wage. And finally, his proposals address and attempt to mitigate how systemic racism impacts access to care. For example, his plans recognize the need to address funding disparities in school districts that have historically disadvantaged students of color, and he recognizes that investment in the childcare sector will have an important impact on women of color who make up an important part of that workforce. So in stark contrast to President Trump, Vice President Biden recognizes the intrinsic and instrumental value of care work and proposes a significantly bigger role for the federal government in strengthening the care sector. And just to conclude, as exciting as the presidential election is, or maybe you find it anxiety-inducing, thinking about the care economy only as it relates to the presidential election is insufficient. And let me end by mentioning 3 reasons why. First, in the US, presidents don't make law. That means any new legislation will require congressional support. So voters need to think about who's running for both the House of Representatives and the Senate. Second, states and municipalities are important in how care work is funded and administered. States provide some 90% of education budgets, and unionized teachers negotiate with local school districts. So voters need to think about governors' races, state legislators' races, and even school board races. Finally, ideas for how we should care about each other often percolate up from civil society and grassroots organizing. So voters also need to think about politics between elections. How are organizations, teachers' unions, gun safety movements, domestic workers associations, racial justice organizations, how are all of these organizations mobilizing for different ideas, around different ideas for how we care about each other? We know that no politician can do everything they promise, but if we care about care after COVID, we should think more about how to build a political agenda to keep the pressure on. Thank you very much. I look forward to a discussion.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for your informative and thought-provoking lecture. It has actually left me thinking about a lot of things. So let me now ask you a few questions. First, in your lecture, you talked about 2 presidential candidates having very different approaches to or visions about the care economy. How do you think these different approaches are being received by American voters? For example, who do you think would be most likely to support President Trump's version, and who would most likely to support Joe Biden's take on the care economy? But by this, I don't really mean just the contrast between the Republicans and the Democrats, but also in terms of gender, socioeconomic and demographic groups, and how those factors square with the electoral dynamics this time.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think, unfortunately, the care economy is not necessarily a big issue for voters. And I was looking at some recent polling data that showed that the overall concern, and this is from Pew Research, the Pew Research Center, and the overall biggest concern voters have right now is about the economy, followed by healthcare. And the coronavirus seems to come in third, which I found pretty shocking. And there's a really interesting, I know you said not to talk about the Republicans versus Democrats, the party split, but there actually is a really interesting party split. So for example, among those who are concerned about the coronavirus, it's actually 82% of Democrats thinks this is an issue, and only 24% of Republicans in this October poll from Pew. So I think that the care economy per se is not going to be top of the mind, which is disappointing. But in terms of but that doesn't mean that there aren't people who don't care about it. And one of the really important groups that is going to be mobilizing around a particular agenda are labor unions. Mm. And for example, Joe Biden has made a real explicit effort to engage with labor unions and to talk about education issues in his campaign, in the primary campaign. And it's not a surprise, given his priorities on education and the care economy generally, that the teachers unions, the major two education labor organizations in the US, the National Education Association and the American Federation of Teachers, both have endorsed him, as have a whole bunch of other state level education associations. Some nurses unions have endorsed Biden as well. So he's got a lot of labor groups, especially labor organizations that are in the care sector, supporting him. But there's one other thing that I thought is interesting to bring up in terms of who supports him, and that is, especially given the impact that the coronavirus has had on women's access to paid employment, or women's experience in paid employment when juggling childcare and homeschooling and paid work, there's a really big gender gap. And one of the things that Donald Trump has been really trying to push recently is winning or maintaining the support of suburban women, particularly suburban white women. And yet he's losing, according to polls, and we'll see how this all plays out, but according to polls among suburban white women, Joe Biden is leading by 10%. So there's a pretty big gender gap there. Does it have to do specifically with the care economy? It's really hard to say, but I think just between labor organizations and the gender gap, we can see that there are some demographic and organizations groups that have more interest in Biden's plan.
Okay. Thank you. That's really, really interesting. And since you raised the question about the labor union and grassroots organization, of course, in your lecture, you also talked about the fact that, if the voters who want to see greater investment in care economy would need to think beyond the presidential election itself and consider congressional and state race and the work of the grassroots organizations. Could you give me a few examples of the, aside from the labor unions, state or local elections where this could be sort of would be crucial, and of the grassroots organizations that organizing that's happening during this election?
Sure. Well, there's this is not an example that has come up only since in the current election period, but there's a great example of the importance of state elections that results from the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. And one of the things that Obamacare did was it offered states the ability to expand Medicaid, which is essentially the government-funded healthcare plan for low-income people. But because of a Supreme Court ruling, states, it wasn't universal. States had to opt into this Medicaid expansion. So just recently in the primary campaign, in the primary elections, the state of Missouri had a ballot initiative that would expand Medicaid expansion to Missourians. And that passed 53% to 47%. So most states have actually expanded Medicaid as part of the Affordable Care Act. But that's a really important kind of issue involving the healthcare sector that takes place at the state level. In terms of local initiatives, there's a really important initiative on the ballot right now in Los Angeles. And it's a bond proposal to raise that would ideally raise, if it passes, $7 billion for investment in local school infrastructure and equipment, as well as investing in tech for students. And this has been made, as I kind of discussed in the lecture, hopefully, the importance of investing in schools has become made more apparent under COVID, especially when you consider a school district like Los Angeles, which, like New York, it's not as big as New York, but like New York, it deals with teaches a lot of vulnerable students, not all of whom have access to tech, access to broadband, have pretty big classes in older buildings. And so those buildings really need investment in infrastructure, and the students themselves need to have access to technology to allow them to learn, especially learning remotely. So that's a really important issue that's on the ballot in the Los Angeles area, and the school board supports it and the teachers union supports it. So that's a nice nice meeting of two often adversarial actors in support of an initiative to raise money for schools.
Thanks very much. And although I have actually a few more questions to ask you, I'm already seeing questions coming from the audience. So let me read one of the first questions from the audience now. This person asks, isn't Trump's agenda of focus on school choice avail for what Republicans and Betsy DeVos want to do eventually, which is eventually to eliminate public school and replace them with charter schools?
Yeah, so school choice is a real, school choices has been an initiative of, but actually both Democrats, I can talk a lot about this, I'll try to keep it short. The idea of school choice, which is essentially born from this idea that traditional public schools, especially in urban areas, haven't really been providing the best kind of education for students. So shouldn't parents have the option to go to either charter schools, which for those of you who don't know are publicly funded but privately managed, and often are outside of the teachers' unions. And then there's also increasingly attention to vouchers, which would allow essentially a parent gets a grant from the school budget and then can take that grant and use it to offset tuition somewhere. And this has been, this started out as a kind of bipartisan thing, because both Democrats and Republicans thought, well, yeah, we need to think about school choice. We need to invest in charters because traditional public schools aren't always doing the best job. In more recent years, and I argue it's actually because of a lot of teachers union activism, there is more, this has become a more Republican agenda item. And Betsy DeVos, who is the Secretary of Education, who's from the state of Michigan, has spent lots of years mobilizing and organizing her resources, and she has a lot of them, against the traditional public school system in the state of Michigan. So yeah, in answer to the question, the focus on school choice is often seen by traditional public school educators as a way to really weaken the traditional public school system, which also means weakening labor unions, and really privatizing or really creating a market for education. And if you're thinking about education in the context of the care economy, as I have tried to present here, I think that poses some real questions about this larger question of how ought we provide care for each other. Because when you say it should all be handled, it should be handled by the marketplace. If we should just let every economic actor decide where they want to send their kids to school and the money flows and follows them, okay, that's one way of doing it, but we lose a sense of public education as a collective good that we all have a role in investing in, whether or not we have kids in school at that time. So I think the move to school choice is really about marketizing education, but we also need to think about it in terms of how it affects or how it impacts our collective commitment to caring for students in schools.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I have another question. Here, the question is, in Canada, care also has become an important political and public policy issue since the pandemic. How do you think care is being debated in Canada? Do you see similarities and differences in the way Canadian and American public and politicians are debating the issue of care? And how do you think the issue of the care economy is affecting politics in Canada?
This is a really important question. And as Dr. Peng noted in the intro, I study comparative politics, which means comparing countries. And so this is right up my alley. I think that in many ways, so one obvious difference between Canada and the United States, of course, is that Canada has the universal healthcare system, and so that's a big difference. And then there are places like Quebec where there's a a provincial childcare policy. But outside of those two things, I think we're seeing a lot of similar debates. Obviously, there's also not an election right now, so that's a different thing too. But I think we're seeing a lot of the same debates. So if you look at the debates about education right now in Ontario, there's, you know, Doug Ford earlier, the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, earlier in the summer was telling teachers and teachers unions who had been engaged in job action just before the pandemic started. But he was essentially saying, okay, we've all sacrificed, we've all had to suck it up, so now it's teachers' time to suck it up too. And so there's a similar kind of adversarial relationship in Ontario vis-a-vis the public school system as there are in other places in the US. So this question about what do we owe our public schools is a question that exists in Canada as well. I think similarly, we see in Canada and the United States some of the most tragic examples of some of the biggest tragedies of COVID took place in long-term care facilities. There are awful stories out of Montreal, awful stories in Ontario. In Nova Scotia, where I am, the single biggest location for COVID-related fatalities was in a long-term care facility. You see the similar kinds of things in the United States. So questions about about long-term care and how do we effectively support the elderly population, and how do we fund, and what kinds of long-term care facilities we actually have, that's an important question in both places. And I will say that because I'm doing a tiny little bit of research on long-term care facilities right now with some colleagues at Acadia, and we did a survey of Nova Scotia workers in Nova Scotia, in 3 different sectors of Nova Scotia workers who were active during the pandemic, and long-term care workers are one of them. And what we heard from long-term care workers in Nova Scotia was that it's been stressful and people feel overworked, but this isn't new, that they've been crying out for years and years and years for more resources in long-term care facilities, more investment, better pay, more staffing, better equipment. And so this isn't the kind of crisis that I think that COVID really brought to light isn't new. So the question about how it's being taken up is an interesting one. And let me just refer again to some research I'm doing, a different project. And this time, it was a project where we were talking to people who were working from home, and we had them write journals in response to different questions about how things were going in the whole, in their working from home life during the pandemic. And when people started talking about what are the big questions, what are the big problems that COVID has exposed, there was a lot of almost fatalism that people in this study really recognized. We have big problems in terms of childcare. We have big problems in terms of long-term care. Our schools we don't have good plans for our schools. And yet there was a real sense that the government isn't going to deal with this. And so I think how we get this on the political agenda is a really important question.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating area. Long-term care is, my area, so I'm tempted to ask questions, but I'm also seeing a lot of questions coming from the audience. So let me turn to the next question. This person asks, Biden promises many things that would be terrific to have. However, he has been vice president for 8 years. So why would we believe that he can keep those promises if elected?
Yeah, well, I think where to begin? I think an important thing to remember about the US system, of course, is that like I said at the end of the talk, the president doesn't make law, right? So you need a Congress. And I think one of the reasons, and one of the reasons that Obama and Biden didn't do more was that at a certain, after 2000 and after the midterms, so they came in, they were elected in 2008. In the midterm election, for those first 2 years, they had a supermajority in the Senate and they had a majority in the House of Representatives, and they were able to pass. That's when they passed the Affordable Care Act, right, which is a huge piece of legislation. But that piece of legislation led to a huge blowback. And in 2010, the subsequent midterms, the Democrats just got wiped out in Congress. And at that point, I mean, there wasn't a lot that the Republicans were willing to play ball with. So I think so that's a defense, I guess, of Biden, not really Biden not being able to do more. And that's why I think it's really important from the perspective of voters to think, well, if I like Biden's proposals, if I think they're good, and I mean, all of this stuff is so super ambitious, and nobody's gonna, I mean, he's got so many plans. Even Trump's bullet points there's a lot of bullet points there, and he's not gonna get them all done either if he gets reelected. But I think that voters have to think about, okay, what, if I like Biden's plan, is not enough for Biden to get elected. I need to send Biden to the White House with a Congress that's going to support those things as well. So voters who might be thinking about splitting their ticket and saying, I'm going to vote for Biden, but I'm going to vote for my Republican senator or a Republican representative in the House, well, that's a guarantee for gridlock. So that's not going to happen. So I think on the part of the voter, you have to, if you like those plans, you have to send Biden to the White House with a Congress that's going to work with him. But also, I think it's really important and I personally study a lot about social movements and grassroots organizing, and especially labor unions. And I think that that organization can never ever let up. You have to keep putting the pressure on all of your elected officials. Otherwise, otherwise they focus on something else that's not important to you. So I think some of the reasons, I think there's structural reasons involving the US system, but I also think that there's, voters aren't off the hook either in terms of when things don't go the way we want them, we're not off the hook either.
Mm. Yeah, here's another question. When talking about the care economy, should we also be focusing on how to prevent pandemics in the first place by addressing how destruction of the environment is causing these pandemics?
Yes. Yeah, in fact, if I could, I think a lot of I mean, I know the question is specifically about the environment, but I think one of the things that, just to think about Biden's plan for a minute, one of the things that he does recognize, and so he recognizes climate change as a really important critical issue, but he also in one of the two education, or I can't remember, one of the two education or the caregiving workforce plans, I mean, he does recognize the importance of environmental racism as one of the things that contributes to inequalities and inequities among different segments of the population. And I think a lot of the work of care activists, whether it's labor unions these days or the gun rights movement or Black Lives Matter and the defunding the police, is really looking at what are the causes of some of the violence? What are the causes of the lack of care? What are the causes of the kinds of inequities that we see in the system? And that, again, that's why I think it's so important for grassroots organizing to have a really important, or to continue to push and have a really important voice, because it's at the grassroots where we're often diagnosing the problem and then trying to get leaders to not just put a Band-Aid on the problem, but actually deal with the root causes of a problem, whether that's violence or structural racism or environmental causes of pandemic. So I mean, the easy answer is yes. And I think, but it's again, up to the grassroots and voters to make sure that politicians are actually dealing with the problem.
Yeah, I think that this is a really important point, and I often hear in the conversations around COVID pandemic and care and environment is that, you know, as care is about interdependencies between people, we also need to think about larger interdependencies between human and nature and the mothers. And so I think it's something that we, you know, I think we could probably discuss some more about. I have another question, and this one asks, to what extent does the result of the US elections influence the consequences of the care economy worldwide?
That's really, that's a really interesting question. So I would, my first instinct was to say, well, it's probably gonna immediately, I mean, the most immediate impact is going to be on the domestic economy of the United States. But then I started thinking about this question of who provides care. And although, as said at the very beginning of the talk, that in the United States, the majority of teachers are white women, but in other care sectors, and I don't have exact data, but in other care sectors, the majority of care workers are made up of women of color and migrant women. So in the healthcare field in the United States and in Canada, there are a lot of immigrant women who are nurses and doctors and in those kinds of caring roles. In the home healthcare sector, there are a lot of immigrant women who work with families on an individual basis. So I guess it doesn't really matter who wins, but if there's a growing demand for care, and that care is going to be, whether private individuals are paying for that care or the care is publicly funded, there's going to be a demand from the United States for immigrant workers in those industries. And does that lead to what we call brain drain from places like the Philippines, who provide lots of nurses to the global north? Or are there going to be other kinds of, is there going to be a global investment in training care workers so that to meet these needs? I mean, I think that's a question. I think that'll be a question. That ILO study is really, really important because it shows that, hey, this is a really important industry. The care economy is so important for us to invest in, and it can provide really decent work. So everybody around the world is going to have an increased demand for paid care. So we should invest in it. And we can create hundreds of millions, literally hundreds of millions of jobs worldwide. If we don't invest in it, I think what we might see is countries like the United States and Canada and the UK relying really heavily on immigrant care workers, and that might have a detrimental impact on the care sectors in those countries, the host countries, home countries.
Well, we have only a couple of minutes left, and there are a lot of questions, but let me just squeeze in one more question. And if you could answer in like 2 minutes or less. This question relates to the just recently appointed Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. So the question is, what does the appointment of Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court strengthening the court conservative majority means for the care economy?
I mean, I think the fear, we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but I think the fear is that among progressives and liberals is that any kind of progressive legislation that might be passed, so the kind of stuff that Joe Biden is proposing, especially in his his policy on care, the care work economy, not the education plan, that even if a Democratic Congress was able to get something passed, that if there was an inevitable court challenge, it would get struck down because of the 6-3 majority. So the fear among progressives and Democrats and liberals is that a 6-3 conservative majority on the court is going to make it really hard. Legislation might get passed, which is good for the care economy, but then it might not withstand a court challenge. So that's the real fear. But of course, we just don't know yet. Mm-hmm. And she was quite evasive in her confirmation, in her hearings about answering hypothetical questions. So it's kind of a wait and see, but I don't think anybody is relishing the court challenges in the future.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much, Rachel. I wish I could ask you more questions, but I think we only have 3 minutes left. So at this point, I would like to ask Gabe to come back. Thank you
so much. And thank you everybody for your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brickner. Thank you, Dr. Brickner and Dr. Peng, for your conversation today. You know, as I was listening, what I was reminded of was just how much has changed in the last 6 months, but also how much the pandemic has exposed in terms of the needs for public services and public policy responses, and the faults in the institutions that we rely on now, and how that's compounding inequities and creating others. And the US election, apart from the suspense surrounding it and the concern we all have about the outcome because of the implications for the world and for us as the US's neighbor, is really a kind of first major milestone in this experience to see how one country is starting to process and respond to what's happening and what we're experiencing. I think Dr. Brickner's talk has helped us see where there's some strengths in the debate and the discussion around the election, and where there's some really big gaps and areas where it's very, very wanting. And I think as Canadians, it's valuable to us always to see what's happening in the United States, because it's a chance for us to understand better the challenges we're facing and how we're responding to them. But I think it's also a reminder that because of some of what we heard said today, we have our own challenges that we have to confront and look at in the months and years ahead. Thank you so much for such a relevant and timely conversation. It's been stimulating, and I think it couldn't have been more topical. I want to say also again, thank you to the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, our great partners, and our parliamentary sponsor, Greg Fergus, for their support. Thank you for joining us. To find out about future Big Thinking events, please check back at our website and subscribe to our newsletter and follow us on social media. We hope to see all of you at events down the road. Have a great day.